Hi, welcome to day 2 of the Neuro AI course. Today we're going to talk about comparing tasks, namely between brains and machines. My name is Laila Wehbe. Just a few words about me. I'm an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University. I am both in the machine learning department and the Neuroscience Institute, and my work is really at the intersection of both of those disciplines. So I use methods from AI and machine learning, and I use neuroimaging in order to record brain activity from people when they do complex tasks like read a book, and try to study how meaning is represented in their brain as they do so. So the mystery for today is, what does it mean when a biological agent and a machine do the same task? So before we talk specifically about different kinds of tasks that both of these types of agents can do, we're going to talk specifically about how they first learn to do these tasks and how they can generalize these tasks basically between different contexts and different environments. And so here across the course, we're going to think of learning as happening across different time scales. So in this case, time here is on the x-axis. And the agent constantly sees observations that are sampled from a latent world state that they don't observe. At the first level, we can think of the latent world state as having properties of the environment or parameters of the environment that change fast to a slower extent than the observations themselves, but they do change kind of more rapidly than higher level parameters, the ones that we call context, which correspond to slow changes in the world that are themselves governed by basically universal constants, which have to do with things like rules of the physical world, etc. And so if we think of a biological agent, it's actually, we can define learning in different ways. It's not a very simple and easy way to define it. So we can think of, for example, of learning for a specific individual. You can think for that individual, maybe we're talking about development. So as after, let's say, a human is born, they need to learn to do many things like walk and read and talk and read and etc. And so are we talking about, going from basically infancy to adulthood, or are we talking about an adult who already knows how to do many things and then needs to learn a new task? We can also talk about learning not at the individual level, but at the species level, for instance, during evolution. You can think of evolution itself as a process of learning that kind of captures basically the slow-moving context. Like the learning can show up basically in terms of in the very genes of the individuals that form a population. And this, like, just the evolution process is kind of the optimization process that is used in order to solve the task of survival. And so, for example, when you're thinking about learning for a specific individual, the level where things change slowly can correspond to this individual learning to learn. So during development, a child can encounter many different cases and can start to learn to generalize across these cases. So they can start to learn to solve problems and learn how to solve problems, so that when they encounter a new problem, which would happen then at basically the latent world state, which changes fast, then they can actually just learn, to solve that problem immediately. So, as an example, as children are growing up, they learn the ability to understand, let's say, games. And then once they are faced with a specific game, they're able to learn the rules and play that game without needing, an entire developmental process to happen. At the level of species, we can think of the context as basically something that a specific species adapts to through evolution. And then given a specific latent word state, the members of that species could actually adapt by learning from the specific environment. Human learning specifically is driven by many factors. We can learn there are many different types of learning that psychologists and neuroscientists study. We can learn through basically just observing the world and computing its inherent statistics. We can also learn by interacting with the world, by manipulating it, by acting in it, by play. We also learn by seeing others behave and imitating them. This way, children, for instance, can learn a lot about the world, can learn what is dangerous, what is not dangerous, what is food, what is not food, how to interact in specific situations. We also have many heuristics which show up as maybe perhaps inductive biases or specific behaviors that like just make our learning more easy. For instance, we know that newborns have really bad sight. They can only focus on nearby objects. And this might appear as a bug, but it could also be a feature by allowing newborns to really focus on the main relevant features for them at the moment, which is basically the face of their caregivers. And from that, build on to recognizing more objects. And so it's, again, for humans, it's not this very easy picture of like, I have an agent and I have a task and I have a objective function and this is how the learning is going to go. Basically, the entire structure that motivates us to learn is complex and it's often part of our own system. For instance, we are very motivated to belong socially in a group. We're very motivated to basically just preserve ourselves. And from those types of instincts, we can just like figure out the right situation, the right behavior in one situation. We're also very motivated by external rewards that we get as sensory, for instance, again, with food or other types of sensory reward. We also often just have activities or just have instincts that help us learn. For instance, children really like play, and it's been shown over and over that play really enhances children's learning and their ability to understand the environment. It's basically just, exploration and test and doing a lot of experimentation with the environment. And the fact that it's inherently fun for kids is definitely something that helps them learn by just motivating them to play more. So we basically have a lot of incentives and a lot of ways in which we learn. But what does that mean? What kind of constraints do we have, and how similar are we to other systems that can also do these same computations or are trying to solve the same problems that we solve? So here there's an interesting kind of quote by David Marr that says that the nature of the computations that underlie perception depends more upon the computational problems that have to be solved than on the particular hardware in which their solutions are implemented. And so this is hinting that actually, if you look at specific problems in perception, the solution for them would require more or less the same kinds of computations. And those computations need to occur whether in the brain or in other artificial agents. And sometimes there's only a few types of solutions or a few types of computations that are possible. And so that can lead us to think, like, would we see a similar organization in the brain, for example, and in other machines that are trying to solve the same task that the brain is solving? Another thing to also keep in mind is that we solve an infinity of tasks as we grow. And we're using the same brain. So the same parts of the brain are doing the same related tasks. For example, in visual perception, we only have one visual system. So it's not like we can train a different network to solve every task we need. So we need to keep reusing the same network, the same architecture, probably different parts of that architecture for specific tasks, but still overlapping components. And this reuse of the same representation, the same structure, the same architecture, is probably also kind of a feature hidden inside these constraints because you're able to generalize across all of these different tasks and all of the different things that you could do. So we're going to explore more this idea in tutorial 1. We're going to start by training the same architecture to do multiple tasks separately, so not at the same time. So we're going to keep reinitializing from scratch. So we have a CNN architecture, for which we change the output head to train on the first task, and then we take the same architecture again, randomly initialized, and train with a different output head to perform a different task. And then again, we take that architecture and use different head to solve a different task. And then we try to look at the representations that are learned by these networks and try to understand basically how do those different tasks change the representations that are learned by the network in the black component here that has the same architecture across these different tasks. Before we get there, let's just talk a little bit more about how we translate tasks from biological agents to AI models. So let's start with a common task between basically psychology and AI. So we're going to think of picture naming. So picture naming is something that a lot of people like to do, specifically kids. They like to look at objects in books or in the world and name them. But this is also a task that's used in psychiatry to verify, for instance, if somebody has intact semantic memory. It's also used in neuroscience to study things like speech production or object recognition in the scanner. So how can we formalize this as a computational task? First, let's just assume that the naming part is trivial. So for example, in neuroscience, you might be actually interested in how a person kind of convert a word in their head to actual sound. That's not what we're concerned by here. Here, we're just going to say the task is given a set of n objects. For example, this could be the ImageNet task, which has 1,000 different categories of objects. You just need to basically classify a particular image and say that it belongs to this particular label. What model could you use? Then, I mean, the next things you need to do is to figure out what model to use, what architecture, what the output of that model would be, what is the objective function, and how to train it. Okay, so for your architecture, you could, for your hypothesis class, you could pick a convolutional neural network with a specific architecture. Let's say you pick something that is like AlexNet, it's just a simple CNN. You need to define your objective function. So now if you define your outputs to be one hot, so this is just a vector that has as many numbers as the number of classes you have, so 1,000 for AlexNet, and then your output would be 0 everywhere except for the one class that you're predicting, which would be 1. And you could use a 0-1 loss in order to evaluate this output. So this would give you 0 if you are actually correct, and basically the bit you activate is actually corresponds to the correct class, and then 1 otherwise. But the problem is that this loss is hard to train because it's not differentiable. You could also pick your output y to instead be a vector of probabilities. You achieve this by using a softmax layer. So now this both gives you a certain measure of uncertainty over the different classes, but also allows you to use a loss function like cross entropy, which has the benefit of being differentiable. So for 1 point, this cross entropy measure just simplifies to basically the log of the probability of the correct class, and there's a minus term. And then this is overall your training set. This would be basically average across all of the samples. And you can optimize this, let's say, with gradient descent, or let's say stochastic gradient descent, or batch gradient descent, etc. We can think of another example, something that's not classification, maybe a regression problem. You're given an object and you need to guess how big that object is just from their image. For as training, you're given a data set of objects, and for each image, you're given the real-world size of the main object in that image, and you need to train a network to predict the size for new objects. You can use the same architecture, but change the output. Your objective function could be actually something like MSE. So here your output would be a real dimensional number, and then you can compute basically the squared error for every point in your training data, and then take the average of that. You can have other types of tasks which are not necessarily visual. For instance, fill in the blanks. You probably did a lot of these exercises in primary school where you're given a sentence, you have to fill in the blank. You can train a language model actually to achieve this task. What the language model does is that it learns to estimate the probability of a given word in a specific context. So given a set of given context here, this context can be all around the word. So both words before and after the word. Sometimes you only use words before. You need to basically output a probability distribution over all the words in the dictionary, and that from that probability distribution, you can determine which word is most likely to fall in a specific context. In order to solve this task, you could choose, for instance, a bidirectional LSTM, which would work well here. Your objective function will be determined as such. So the output here is a vector of probabilities, right? One for each word in your vocabulary. You can again use cross entropy. So again, basically this would correspond for one word, this would correspond to the log of the probability of that word in your model. And then that's average over all the words, and you take the negative. This is usually the average cross entropy. Often when you hear about language models, you will hear people talk of perplexity, which is just the exponential of this value. So these are some examples of machine learning tasks that we've described here. They fall under different buckets that we usually organize machine learning tasks as. So we generally have supervised problems, such as classification, like picture naming, and regression. So like the size estimation problem we saw. We also have more unsupervised learning, or more recently self-supervised learning problems, which would correspond to the language modeling task we talked about. So this is a generative process that we're learning that we could use to generate new words and then also even sentences. We have more complex, other types of problems that people have posed using such models to learn, probabilistic models other than language models. There are other types of basically self-supervised supervision that we could do. One big one that we are also going to talk about in one of the tutorials is contrastive learning, in which you just don't necessarily impose a lot of constraint into the problem. Instead, you just force the network to learn similar representations for objects that are similar, and different representations for objects that are not the same. And that contrastive learning has actually resulted in a lot of very powerful models. You also have an entirely different class of models that don't just passively learn from the environment, but also interact with the environment. These could be the reinforcement learning agents that are achieving things, for example, like continuous motor control, or being used in other tasks in robotics. And tutorial 3 is going to address some of those problems. At an even higher level, you can have agents that not just try to solve the problem on their own, but actually interact with others. So we've talked a lot about learning, but this is not the only part of the problem. We also need to talk about how good the result of this learning is, and how much does it generalize, because we discussed basically the environment changing across different time scales. And so it's important whenever you do learning to actually also assess the generalization. Usually, when we talk in machine learning, when we talk about generalization, the first thing we think about is just generalization out of sample, but still in the same condition, the same distribution. So you have a separate test set, or a test set that is still sampled from the same distribution as your training data, but on which you can see basically how well is your model doing in distribution. And some questions we will discuss in tutorial 1 is basically how much data do you need in order to get a model that actually generalizes well to data that is out of sample but still in distribution. And you will be asked in tutorial 1 to show basically how does your test performance changes with the amount of data that you use for training. And a different notion of complexity is iteration complexity. So for a given data set and a given size, how long do you need to train in order for the algorithm to converge? How many times should the algorithm touch each training point? And in tutorial 1, we'll also be asked to show this iteration complexity for each sample size. We have other types of generalization which are of interest as well. So not for a test set from the same distribution, but for new cases, new setups. And we're going to just talk a little bit more about what these kinds of out-of-distribution settings could be. You could have, for example, think of a data set which has basically 2 dimensions, And in this case, all of the observed data is in the same distribution. Then you could have cases in which the data that is not observed is basically still kind of shares a lot of commonalities with other points in the data set, so that you can actually do interpolation and guess what that data would look like. You have also cases in which a big part of the data set is missing, and you still have some notion of how to combine some of the different dimensions, but for an entire part of the space, you would need to basically learn how to create new conjunctions in order to understand or to predict what the data would look like. You also have settings in which basically you need to do extrapolation. So you already have seen how specific dimensions can be combined, and then given a new value for one of the dimensions, you have to guess basically what that would look like. And you have also more extreme cases in which you have only one dimension that you start with, which is the shape dimension here. And color is not really a dimension. You just have one color to start with. And then you're given, now suddenly color is a dimension. So you have to basically generalize to this new dimension and how specific shapes would look like under these new different colors. All right, so we can go back to our organization of generalization. So we saw different examples of generalization in out of distribution settings. Those are usually basically referred to in the machine learning under the umbrella term of dataset shift. So we have different types of dataset shift that can happen. You can have the shift be at the covariate, so at the input or the output or the label shift. You can have something like concept drift, where basically the thing that you're trying to predict will change, and part of the change could be due to your actual deployment of your model. For instance, you can release a very strong spam filter, but then the world or the spammers will adapt to your filter, and then that will cause the data to change. You can have a temporal shift, for instance, in the stock market, where just the conditions that applied a while ago do not apply anymore. You can have other types of things that can basically inhibit and prevent generalization. For instance, you could have dataset bias, which will just introduce all sorts of confounders, and that could be bad for learning and generalization, and also bad for things in the real world. We also have the concept in generalization of that some tasks could be more general than others. So, for instance, a task like language modeling, especially when you train a model over a very large data set, it can lead to representations that can be used in other downstream tasks. And that's been basically the way that NLP has worked for the past many years. And so the idea here is that the language modeling task will just give to the network a very powerful representation that can be used in other tasks. But if you maybe train the same network on a more specific task, that's much more focused on a specific aspect of language, maybe that could not generalize as well to other tasks or even to the task of language modeling. So there's a notion which the task itself kind of gives more or less generalization. As an example of this, I'm going to basically discuss a recent debate from the neuroscience literature about the significance of recent results, which saw that there's a lot of similarity between activity in the brain and their presentations in language models. So typically what people do in these experiments that I'm talking about is that the subject sits in the scanner and reads a book or listens to stories. So they use or even watches movies. And from that complex stimulus, researchers use a neural network to extract linearized representations, so vectors of numbers that correspond to the information in the stimulus. And that same stimulus is used in neuroimaging to acquire brain activity that corresponds to the different words. And then researchers build a predictive model that goes from the vector representation to the brain activity. And then they see which areas of the brain are well predicted by the vector representation of the language stimulus. And over and over, people have found that word-by-word activations from a language model predict the activity of the language regions in the brain, and with unprecedented performance. So there's a very strong alignment between those two. So what does that mean? So one set of researchers find that the reason why we are seeing this strong alignment is that the brain itself is kind of a language model. It's constantly trying to predict the next word. And so this is what this is indicating. This is evidence to the fact that the brain is a language model. Another set of researchers just have a different explanation for this and say that basically this language modeling task is very complex and very difficult, and it requires general representations, so very expressive representations, which can contain a lot of information about language. And some of that information about language also is relevant for the brain and for what the brain is doing as it's listening to those words. And so that's why these representations from the language network these representations from language models predict the brain activity well, specifically in the language network in the brain. So in tutorial 1, we're also going to explore this notion of transferability and of basically which task is more general by using the same architecture as before, but this time we're going to train it on a task, and then we're going to fix the weights and train ahead for another task. And we're going to see how well the representations that are learned for task A how well do they generalize to task B. And based on which task we use as source and which task we use as target, we can say something about which tasks are more general than other tasks. So in tutorial 2, we will use the same architecture again. But we will perform a different task on it. So here we again want to build powerful representations, and we're going to use for that contrastive learning. So in contrastive learning, we make it such that the two samples that are of the same kind, so in this case the same digits from MNIST, have a representation that is closer together than two samples that are not of the same type. So here not the same digit. And we'll do some interpretation of the results and see how this particular paradigm is very powerful. So in tutorial 3, we will again go back to the notion of learning at different temporal scales, but we will explore a very different type of learning, specifically reinforcement learning. And we will look at a paper by Wang et al., in which the authors propose that the prefrontal cortex in the brain is actually doing meta-reinforcement learning. So in some sense, what it does is that it learns to learn. And then once it has learned to learn and it's faced with a new environment, it just dynamically learns in that environment what to do given the specific environment properties. So what they do is that they use basically an LSTM in order to implement a process that can actually do reinforcement learning on the fly once the agent is deployed. And so this reinforcement learning algorithm that is basically being deployed in the LSTM activation after training will just learn basically 4 different word states what to do. And then actually the authors will train this network in different contexts. In one context, the different episodes are not related to each other. And in another context, the different episodes are anti-correlated. So there's a lot of information from the previous episode for the next episode. And so they show also how this LSTM agent can basically take advantage of this additional information and learn to generalize in a different way, given this basically slow-moving context. So to end, we can go back to humans and then wonder basically how do we learn to generalize? How do we learn and how do we generalize what we learn? And again, basically we're doing this across multiple different levels. We can talk about it in multiple different levels. I'm going to just mention basically one of the most extreme versions of learning, which is expertise, or like reaching the peak in a specific domain. For instance, becoming a chess grandmaster. And I really like this book because it like it's close to kind of basically how I feel about pedagogy, but also it like outlines basically a very nice secret about being an expert, which is that all of the experts that are surveyed in this book actually have gotten there through deliberate practice. And so this is not just saying that you need to practice over and over and over blindly, but you're actually always practicing in a very mindful way, where you're always picking a task that's slightly more difficult than what you can do, and you have a coach that can lead you through it, and you constantly reevaluate yourself. There's a whole set of things you can do. But the idea is that as you're doing this and constantly trying to basically do something that's a bit too hard, you're gradually building a representation. And once you build that representation of the task that you're trying to do, you can basically get to the next level. And so basically those representations that you're building build on each other in order for you to become able to do what you do. And in some sense, I think we can also think about learning at different stages as also building different representations. And just to remind you that it is possible to compare human learning to machines, but human learning is really very complex, and we don't have anything that's related to that in machines yet. And again, remember that we don't have separate systems, one for each task. We're continuously just like fine-tuning the same system that we have. And we don't, like, learning is not as clearly delineated as in machines. We don't have an objective function, and our different regions also don't have that. It's a much more general process, and it's intertwined in so many different things. The same architecture can support many tasks. It occurs over different time scales. We have intrinsic motivations that can like enforce learning and maybe sometimes even prevent it. We have a lot of imitation learning. We have a lot of social drive. We are motivated by very long-term rewards. For instance, people go through med school or try to get a PhD, which is like maybe unheard of in a machine in terms of length of the reward. And we have cool things like, for example, learning itself is rewarding. So there's some evidence that children actually like to learn the meaning of words just for the sake of learning them. So they're actually intrinsically motivated by learning. And it's a pretty cool set of research. And I don't think it's like really technically corresponds to what we do in machines. These are the references for what we discussed today. Thank you for listening, and good luck with today.